So as I was preparing this course, Masterpiece of World Literature, teaching world literature, thinking about the big picture, which is one of the things that these kinds of courses allows you and forces you to do, I began to notice the incredible importance, which I hadn't quite been as conscious of before, of different writing technologies on the history of literature. And so the more I started to think about that, the more I was struck by that, and I ended up writing a book about that called The Written World, which is about the intersection of storytelling and writing technologies. And of course, one reason why I was struck by the importance of writing technologies is because of our very own moment. We are living through one of the rare periods in world history that is experiencing incredible changes in writing technologies and how we write, how literature is distributed, how it is read. And so I was thinking about the influence of that and this transformative moment that we are living through, and using that to look back at the 4,000 years of literature that we've experienced, looking back at earlier moments of similar transformation when different new writing technologies emerged and how they influenced the history of literature, how they influenced world literature.
Let's talk a little bit about that influence. Why is it important to think about writing technologies and literature at the same time?
Right. It doesn't seem that important when you first think about it. Why does it matter whether a story is written on clay or on paper or parchment, stretched animal skins, or papyrus, which is made from leaves of the papyrus plant, or paper? Doesn't it only matter what people write, not what they write on? But that's one of the things that I started to notice, how much it matters. Let's start with the first piece of literature that exists, the first masterpiece of world literature, namely the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written on clay. And once I started to think about what does it mean to write on clay, I started to read the Epic of Gilgamesh and realized that it actually takes place in an entire world made of clay. The city in which it takes place is made of clay, the buildings are made of clay, the city walls is made of clay, the vessels in which food is being cooked and transported are made of clay. It's all clay. And so this is a kind of clay civilization, and its greatest achievement is this epic, which presents itself as being written and which brags about this clay civilization. There's even mention of the clay pits in the city of Uruk, from which, of course, the material, clay, that was used to build the city and that was used for the tablets on which the Epic of Gilgamesh was written, was taken. So this material, clay, seemed crucially important for the civilization from which writing emerged, the first invention of writing. So that's just one example.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about other worlds that are, beyond Uruk, what other material? How do we see materials interplay with literature and with?
Yeah. So looking back from our own transformative moment, one of the technologies that seemed to me crucial was paper. Yeah. And paper doesn't seem like a big deal. Yes, it's nice and flat and can be rolled and folded and so on and so forth, but how different is it really from parchment or papyrus? But paper was crucial because parchment, the stretched animal skins, for example, is very expensive to make. You need hundreds of animals for a big book. So paper basically lowered the cost of literature. And that, if you lower the cost of and the availability of literature, often two things happen. Suddenly more people have access to literature, so it's a kind of a democratizing moment. And that also means that new types of literature emerge. Often it means that there are more popular types of literature or simply new forms of literature. So one of the masterpieces of world literature is The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu, a lady in waiting, at the court of Japan in around the year 1000 AD. And I had a similar experience from that to when I read The Tale of Genji, namely, it is the first novel written on paper by hand, and it too takes place in a paper world. This is a world of paper screens. Houses are made of paper. There are screens. There are small poems that are exchanged in very elaborate and sophisticated paper. It matters what kind of paper you choose. Hats were made of paper. There were even weapons made of paper. So this kind of a paper world in which Murasaki Shikibu sets this court novel that is the first great novel in world literature.
So it sounds like some of the most important inventions to do with writing technologies have been what literature is written on and what writing is written on. Right. What about the writing itself? What kind of inventions have been really consequential?
Right. So the invention of writing itself is a strange story, and we don't really know how it happened, though there are stories about the origin of writing. One of the things that struck me when I looked at the world history from the perspective of writing technologies is that writing was invented at least twice. It was invented in Mesopotamia, and of course there are other early writing cultures such as China or Egypt, though we can't be sure that the idea of writing somehow transferred from Mesopotamia on the Eurasian landmass. These different civilizations were in indirect contact with each other. But we know for sure that writing was invented at least twice because it was also invented in the Americas by the Maya. And there was no contact between the Maya and Eurasia. So it was invented twice in different forms. And then, of course, the question is different. What kinds of types of writing? What kind of code do you use? There are these the early forms of writings were pictograms, signs that capture entire objects or ideas. But then the invention of the alphabet changes all of that. It vastly reduces the number of signs you need to know from hundreds to 24. It makes writing much easier, connects it much more closely to speech. And that becomes important for the Homeric epics, who are written in the alphabet. In one way, the alphabet is perfected in Greece for the purpose of writing down the Homeric epics. So here again, a close connection between a form of writing and an important texts. And then of course these foundational texts get used to teach students how to read and write. So people in Greece becomes a very literate culture because the relative ease of the alphabet, and the Greeks learn how to read and write by studying Homer.
Yeah, and so it's interesting to think about, the effect that paper has had worldwide, or the effect that the Greek alphabet has had worldwide. Right. These technologies circulate beyond their original point of invention, so those must have some of their own stories.
They have their own stories. For example, paper invented in China gets adopted in the Arabic world in a battle. There's a story even how the Arabs took prisoners, Chinese prisoners of war, and tortured the secret of paper making out of them. It's probably a mythical story, but it shows how important this invention was seen as having been. And then it, through the Arabic world, arrives in Europe just for the invention of, or reinvention of print. And print, of course, is the big other writing technology that had such transformative effects. And here it's important to note again that it had to be reinvented. It was invented first in China and then reinvented many hundreds of years later in Northern Europe. And because it was invented twice, you can compare the effects of print in both cultures. And I see an interesting pattern where, on the one hand, what I said about paper, it leads to a kind of democratizing of literature, because it lowers the cost of literature even more, and that means it lowers the barriers of entry into the literate world. And so it leads to more literacy, different kinds of literature, more popular literature, a flowering of popular or vernacular literature. But at the same time, it also means that these new technologies favor often old and foundational texts. So the first surviving printed text in the world is a Buddhist sutra, so a religious text that had existed for many hundreds of years. So Buddhism was one of the early adopters, if you will, of this writing technology of print in China. And the same happened in Northern Europe, where the first large book printed by Gutenberg was the Latin Bible. So a kind of interesting double effect, where some of the most revered religious or epic texts often are the early adopters of new writing technologies. So these writing technologies favor the texts that are already dominant in a culture. At the same time, it leads to this often a flowering of popular literature and new kinds of literature and new people reading and writing, and that's interesting.
And those stories seem connected because even the sacred texts, the special texts, when they become when they get this sort of treatment of cheap material, of mass-producible material, then they become more accessible to a wider readership as well.
And that then leads to straight to the story of world literature, in that it leads to the coinage of world literature by Goethe in 1827, who experiences a world market in literature. And that market is driven, of course, by trade and circumnavigation of the globe, European empires forcing different parts of the world into contact, but also by these writing technologies that fuel this imperial expansion, like paper, like print, like the alphabet. So these writing technologies bring this modern world of world literature, where we have one world market in literature, and the circulation of literature bring that world into being.
Yeah, I think it's great that we are sort of moving forward now to the modern world, and maybe even a little bit closer to the contemporary world. Are we done with these inventions of writing? You know, the paper and the alphabet, these seem very foundational. What's going on now with inventions in writing, and how is that affecting modern literature?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about our own moment from that perspective is that we are changing all dimensions of literature. We're changing the materials in which it is written. E-paper was one of the breakthroughs in the 90s, but also how literature is distributed and how it is reproduced. So it's almost as if the invention of paper and the invention of print were happening at the same time. Of course, we're still using our old writing codes, the alphabet or non-alphabetic writing systems, though of course we now have a lot of computer languages, though they have different purposes. They're not really designed to capture storytelling with human natural languages, but it certainly, I would compare it to a kind of, to the invention of paper and print at the same time. And also different formats, because different writing technologies favor different formats. So the papyrus scroll, for example, was the continuous scroll that was really favored by that technology, whereas parchment allowed for the invention of the book, the codex, a Roman invention, the book that we have today. And here again, today's writing technologies lead to new formats. Twitter, Facebook updates, new forms of hypertexts.
Which are codex related, but also scroll related.
Also scroll related. And that's the other interesting thing. If I look back from today's writing technologies and the inventions into the 4,000 years of literature, I'm struck by the fact that some of these ancient techniques are coming back. The scroll is coming back. For the first time, we are scrolling again. And the tablet. You know, we started with the Epic of Gilgamesh, written on tablets, and then the scroll or the book took over, and now we are back at the tablet. And that shows that the history of 4,000 years of literature and writing technologies isn't just a prehistory, but it is also a kind of store of technologies and formats and stories that we keep coming back to and rediscovering in different ways.